10 minutes after takeoff from Miami, a ValuJet DC-9 slammed into the Florida Everglades, killing all 110 people on board. The engines were running. The wings were intact. But a fire raging in the cargo hold had already crippled the airplane from the inside. That fire started with a device that was not supposed to be there at all. A banned piece of safety equipment loaded as if it were harmless scrap. This is how a spent oxygen generator slipped into the belly of Flight 592 and turned a routine hop to Atlanta into a race no one on board could win.
On the ramp that afternoon, the scene looked ordinary. 110 people filed onto the DC-9, headed north out of Miami. A mechanic on his way home, a retired couple going to see their grandchildren, a young flight attendant still learning the rhythm of the job. They buckled in as the cabin lights dimmed and the engines spooled up, unaware that dangerous cargo had already been sealed beneath their feet. Below the cabin floor, ramp workers had closed the forward cargo door on a mix of luggage, spare tires, and several cardboard boxes marked as used aircraft parts and company material. The labels said the canisters inside were spent, safe. In reality, they were unexpended chemical oxygen generators, devices regulations did not allow in a passenger jet's cargo hold precisely because of their fire risk.
Chemical oxygen generators are designed to save lives. When a passenger pulls down an oxygen mask, a hidden canister triggers a chemical reaction that produces oxygen, along with intense heat. As long as they're installed correctly and left undisturbed, they're part of a carefully engineered emergency system. But the moment those same devices are removed from an aircraft, they become hazardous materials. They must have safety caps installed. They must be cooled, packaged in special containers, labeled as hazardous, and they must never be loaded into a sealed cargo hold on a passenger jet.
The FAA had long restricted these generators for exactly that reason. In the months before the accident, ValuJet had contracted a maintenance company called SabreTech to remove expired generators from several of its aircraft. SabreTech technicians pulled 144 generators from the planes, many of them still fully capable of producing heat and oxygen if accidentally triggered. Instead of treating them as hazardous cargo, workers packed a number of these canisters into cardboard boxes. They failed to install all of the required safety caps, and they marked the paperwork to suggest the canisters were either empty or simply company material. On the 11th of May, several of those boxes, along with 2 main tires and 1 nose tire, were loaded into the forward cargo hold of Flight 592. The pilots were told they were carrying routine spare parts. On the cargo manifest, nowhere did the words hazardous materials appear. The industry already knew what could happen. Back in 1988, a chemical oxygen generator had caused a serious cargo fire on an American Airlines flight, one that only barely managed to land safely in Nashville. Yet 8 years later, airlines were still flying with cargo compartments that had no smoke detection and no fire suppression. And dangerous devices were still slipping through the system. For the first few minutes, everything about Flight 592 looked completely normal. The DC-9 climbed through scattered clouds as Miami departure handed the crew off from one controller to the next. About 6 minutes after takeoff, something changed in the forward cargo compartment. Investigators believe that 1 or more oxygen generators were jostled or accidentally activated, starting a chemical reaction that produced intense heat in the middle of cardboard, plastic, and rubber tires. In the sealed, unmonitored space beneath the cabin floor, a fire began to feed itself. Without smoke detectors in that cargo hold, the first warnings didn't come from instruments. They came from people. Passengers reported a loud bang, then the smell of smoke. Moments later, smoke began seeping into the cabin, and then into the cockpit itself. ValuJet 592 was suddenly in a race it could not win. The crew declared an emergency,
told air traffic control they needed to return to Miami immediately and started a left turn back toward the airport. They were dealing with smoke, ambiguous warnings, and an airplane that still looked flyable on the instruments, all while the fire continued to grow beneath them. Inside the cargo hold, the heat from the oxygen generators was intense enough to weaken structural components and burn through control cables. This compartment had no built-in extinguishers, no sensors to tell the pilots what was happening below. As the aircraft turned back toward land, the flight controls began to degrade. The nose pitched up, then down. The crew fought to maintain control, with limited time, limited information, and an invisible enemy eating through the airplane's systems. Just over 10 minutes after takeoff, at 13 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, ValuJet Flight 592 plunged into the Florida Everglades at high speed. The airplane broke apart in the swamp. Everyone on board was killed. Rescue crews who rushed to the scene found no survivors. Only wreckage scattered across the water and sawgrass. From the mangled pieces of a DC-9, investigators now had to reconstruct not just a flight, but a system of maintenance, oversight, and regulation that had allowed a banned device onto a passenger jet. The National Transportation Safety Board recovered the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder and began the painstaking work of mapping the airplane's final minutes. The recorders showed a normal takeoff, a routine climb. Then, a sudden onset of smoke, alarms, and confusion as the crew struggled to understand what was happening beneath them. At the crash site, investigators quickly focused on the forward cargo compartment. They found remnants of aircraft tires and multiple chemical oxygen generators, some showing clear signs of having activated in the heat of the fire. Tracing serial numbers and paperwork led them back to SabreTech's maintenance facility, where those canisters had originally been removed from ValuJet aircraft. What they found there was startling. SabreTech had no robust system for tracking hazardous materials. Expired oxygen generators were stored and moved like ordinary scrap parts. Some safety caps were missing or improvised. Boxes were marked empty when the canisters inside were still fully capable of generating heat and oxygen. ValuJet itself came under intense scrutiny. The airline had grown rapidly as a low-cost carrier, outsourcing heavy maintenance to contractors like SabreTech, while keeping only a small in-house technical staff. Investigators found that ValuJet's oversight of its contractors was weak, and that employees were not adequately trained in hazardous materials handling, despite the company having a formal no-carry policy for dangerous goods. The FAA was not spared either. Investigators criticized the agency for allowing airlines to operate cargo compartments with no smoke detection or fire suppression, despite repeated warnings after earlier cargo fires. Regulators had known for years that hidden fires in sealed holds were a serious risk. But the fixes had been slow and incomplete. In its final report, investigators concluded that the fire in Flight 592's forward cargo compartment was initiated by one or more oxygen generators improperly carried as cargo. 3 primary failures were identified: SabreTech's packaging and labeling of the generators, ValuJet's oversight of its maintenance program, and the FAA's failure to require smoke detection and fire suppression in cargo holds like the one on this airplane. The banned device hadn't been smuggled aboard by a saboteur. It had walked through the front door of the system, on mislabeled paperwork, in routine cargo, under the cover of assumptions that someone else had already checked the box. The consequences were severe. ValuJet was grounded for months as regulators went through every aspect of its operations. The airline eventually returned, but with a reduced fleet and a reputation that never fully recovered. The company later merged with AirTran Airways and began operating under that name, quietly burying the old logo along with the memories of Flight 592. SabreTech faced criminal charges and civil penalties for mishandling hazardous materials. Some convictions were later overturned on appeal,
but the company was fined and eventually went out of business altogether. At the FAA, the crash triggered genuine soul-searching. For years, the agency's mandate had been a balancing act between promoting aviation and regulating it, a dual mission that critics said made the FAA too cozy with the industry it was supposed to oversee. After Flight 592, that mandate was rewritten. Safety first, explicitly, above commercial considerations. In 1996, regulators banned the type of chemical oxygen generators involved from passenger aircraft cargo holds. Airlines were required to install smoke detectors and automatic fire suppression systems in previously unprotected cargo compartments, with deadlines for retrofitting fleets around the world. Hazardous materials training requirements were strengthened. Carriers were pushed to take responsibility not just for their own employees, but for every contractor who touched their airplanes. The changes didn't bring Flight 592 back, but they meant that future fires were far more likely to be detected early and fought automatically, and that the kind of paperwork shortcuts that doomed this flight would be much harder to hide. ValuJet Flight 592 is often remembered in a single image, a scar of black water in the Everglades, where an airliner disappeared in seconds. But the real story is about what happens when a safety device is treated like scrap metal, when training is skipped, when oversight assumes that someone else is watching. The lesson for airlines is stark. Hazardous materials aren't just drums of fuel or barrels of chemicals. They can be small, familiar parts taken off yesterday's airplane and tossed into tomorrow's cargo. If those parts aren't tracked, labeled, and handled with respect, they can turn a routine turnaround into a mass casualty event. For regulators, Flight 592 showed what delay costs. Warnings about cargo fires and oxygen generators were on the table years before the crash, but the push to tighten the rules moved slower than the growth of low-cost carriers and outsourced maintenance. After the accident, that pace changed. Cargo compartments were upgraded, oversight of newer airlines was hardened, and the culture shifted toward anticipating worst-case scenarios instead of hoping they wouldn't happen. And for passengers, there is an uncomfortable truth. When you sit down and snap your seatbelt closed, your safety depends not only on the skill of the pilots and the strength of the wings, but on every small decision made in back rooms and loading docks you'll never see. On Flight 592, a banned device slipped through all of those layers. Not because the rules didn't exist, but because people and systems failed to live up to them. Today, every time a cargo fire is detected early and flooded with extinguishing agent, every time a hazardous shipment is stopped before it reaches the ramp, a quiet echo of ValuJet 592 is present. The smoke that filled that DC-9 changed how the world thinks about what rides underneath your feet, and turned a single line on a cargo manifest into a matter of life and death.